I stood frozen at the bedroom door, my chest tightening with anxiety as I watched my husband Stephen packing his briefcase. The tension in our once happy home hung thick like a heavy fog, suffocating every corner of the room. With a trembling voice barely above a whisper, I couldn't believe he was doing this to us. When Stephen looked up at me, with those cold eyes, he reminded me that someone had to work to support this family. His words cut deep, bringing back the painful memory of the decision I'd made just days before. I defended myself, explaining that I'd quit my job for us, for our family. The sound of his briefcase snapping shut echoed through the room like a gunshot. He accused me of not being able to handle the pressure of work, claiming I was trying to burden him with everything. As anger swelled in my chest like a rising tide, I stepped into the room. I challenged his assumption, reminding him that I had been a successful attorney before he pressured me to quit. His words hit their mark with painful accuracy. True, I was struggling to adjust to life as a full-time housewife, but I never expected such resentment from my husband. I tried to make him understand how hard I was trying, how difficult it was to leave a career I loved. He ran his fingers through his hair and sighed, attempting to change the subject to an important discussion about his parents tonight. Our conversation was interrupted by tiny footsteps in the hallway. Our daughter Sienna appeared in the doorway, her blonde curls disheveled, clutching her teddy bear to her chest. She asked why we were yelling, her innocent voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I crouched down to her level, forcing a smile that felt like a mask on my face. I assured her that we weren't yelling, just talking. Stephen lifted Sienna up and kissed her forehead, sending her off to find her grandmother, who was probably making pancakes. As I watched our daughter run away, guilt pierced my heart like a sharp needle. I wondered how many times those little ears had heard our arguments, each fight another crack in her innocent world. I watched as Stephen set down his briefcase, his expression softening in a way that made my stomach churn. He told me he had an idea that would lead us in a better direction tonight. As he left for work, all I could do was nod, not trusting my own voice, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. I couldn't shake this overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong, like dark clouds gathering before a storm. The day dragged on with mundane housework and the constant chatter of my in-laws, their voices like an endless drone in my ears. When Stephen finally came home, I was desperate for adult conversation that didn't revolve around gossip or grandchildren, my mind starving for meaningful dialogue. After the children were tucked in bed, we sat in the study, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Stephen leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his posture reminding me of a lawyer preparing to present a case. He started by saying he'd been thinking about how to solve our problems, his voice carrying that familiar tone of having already made up his mind. I raised my eyebrows, my heart already preparing for disappointment. Oh, was all I could manage. He nodded with a smile playing at his lips, like a man about to reveal a brilliant solution. Then came his grand proposal, using our savings to buy his parents a house nearby, suggesting they could help more with the children and reduce our burden. I felt all the air leave my lungs, as if I'd been punched in the stomach. I reminded him, my voice trembling, that this was our savings, meant for our future and the children's college education, questioning if this was really the best use of our money. His smile vanished like a light being switched off. He said he thought I would be happy, claiming it would solve many problems. Our problems? I heard my voice rise with disbelief. Or your parents' problems? I added, feeling decades of resentment bubbling to the surface. Stephen stood up, his entire body radiating irritation like heat from a furnace. He demanded to know why I had to make everything so difficult, insisting this was a good solution and best for our family. I sat there stunned as he stormed out of the study, his footsteps echoing like thunder through our home. Was this really happening? My husband had just proposed using our life savings to buy his parents a house, without even consulting me first. I buried my face in my hands, feeling more alone than ever before in our 15 years of marriage. How had we gotten here, and more importantly, what was I going to do about it? The next morning, whispers from the kitchen woke me, cutting through the early morning silence. There was no mistaking the voices, Stephen and his mother. I crept down the hallway, carefully avoiding the creaky floorboard near the stairs, feeling like an intruder in my own home. Stephen's voice carried clearly to where I stood. He was telling his mother that I was being unreasonable, that he had expected me to be pleased. His mother's response was soft but clear as crystal, her words cutting deeper than any knife. His mother's words were dripping with contempt, telling her son that some women just couldn't handle the pressures of domestic life, that not everyone was cut out for it. I bit my lip hard, fighting back the surge of anger and pain that threatened to overwhelm me. I heard Stephen assure his mother that if they proceeded with their plans, I would eventually come around. He insisted it was for the best, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescension that had become all too common lately. I'd heard enough to make my blood boil. I stepped into the kitchen, making no attempt to hide my presence, and demanded to know who exactly this best was for. They jumped like guilty children caught stealing cookies, their faces a picture of shocked embarrassment. His mother was the first to recover, plastering on that saccharine smile I'd grown to detest over the years. She had the audacity to ask if I'd slept well, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. I ignored her completely, fixing my gaze on my husband instead. I asked him point blank if he'd ever planned to discuss this with me, or if sneaking around behind my back was his preferred method now. Stephen had the grace to look ashamed, stammering that it wasn't what it looked like, that they were just talking. I cut him off mid-sentence, my voice sharp as I pointed out that they were discussing major financial decisions without me. These weren't just any decisions, they were about our future, our children's future. His mother, ever the self-appointed peacemaker, stepped between us like she'd done countless times before. With her practiced diplomatic air, she suggested taking the children to the park so Stephen and I could talk things through. Before I could protest, she had already swept out of the kitchen, calling for Mateo, our son, and Sienna. The front door closed with a final click, leaving Stephen and me in a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. I spoke quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, begging him to stop this pattern. I pleaded with him to stop excluding me from decisions that affected our family. Stephen ran his fingers through his hair and sighed, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before. He denied excluding me, claiming he was just trying to find solutions, then had the nerve to suggest I was the one who'd become distant since quitting my job. That's what you wanted. I exploded, years of resentment finally boiling over. I reminded him that he was the one who'd constantly insisted I needed to focus on our family, and now that I had, he treated me like some kind of failure. When he tried to step toward me, I backed away, feeling like a cornered animal in my own kitchen. Stephen insisted it wasn't like that, trying to convince me that things would be easier with his parents helping with the children, offering what he called support. Support? I let out a bitter laugh that tasted like vinegar in my mouth. I told him plainly how his mother could barely hide her contempt for me, and his father, well, he acted as if I didn't even exist. Stephen's face hardened like cement setting in the sun. He defended his parents, claiming they had only been helpful since I quit my job. Helpful? I exploded, my voice rising like steam from a kettle. I felt suffocated, explaining how I couldn't make a single decision about our children without his mother questioning it, and now they wanted to use our savings to buy them a house. He threw up his hands in frustration, demanding to know what else we should do with the money, letting his words trail off into silence. As I watched him standing there, pleading for understanding, I truly saw him for the first time in months. This wasn't the man I had married, he had become a stranger wearing my husband's face. "I can't do this anymore, Stephen," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't bear being pushed aside in my own family, feeling like a ghost in my own home. His expression softened, like melting snow. He tried to calm me down, insisting we could work things out if only we would. The front door's creak interrupted his words, cutting through the tension like a knife. His parents' voices filled the house, mixing with our children's excited chatter. "Mom, Dad." Sienna called out, her voice full of childhood innocence. She wanted to show us something she'd found at the park. I forced a smile as my daughter burst into the kitchen, holding a shining stone above her head like a precious trophy. But over her golden curls, I caught my mother-in-law's triumphant expression, like a cat who just caught her prey. I could see the triumph in her eyes, knowing she had won this round. As I knelt there, praising Sienna's treasure, I made a silent vow to myself. This wasn't going to be the end. I wouldn't allow myself to be pushed out of my own family, not like this. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. The question was whether I had the strength within me to make that change happen. I sat at the kitchen table, staring intently at the laptop screen before me, my heart racing with both excitement and guilt. Job listings scrolled past, each one a glimpse of the life I had walked away from, like photographs from a past existence. My fingers ached to type out a resume, muscle memory from years of legal briefs still lingering in my hands. The pull to return to my law career, where I once thrived, was magnetic, almost overwhelming. The sound of Stephen's car pulling into the driveway snapped me back to reality like a rubber band. Guilt washing over me, like a tidal wave, I quickly shut the laptop. What was I doing? I had made promises to my family, sworn to put them first. Stephen walked in, his face lit up with that familiar smile that used to make my heart skip. He suggested taking the kids out for dinner tonight. I forced a smile onto my face, feeling like an actress in my own home. I asked about the children's whereabouts, trying to keep my voice steady. He casually mentioned that his mother had taken them to the mall for school clothes. I felt my carefully constructed smile falter. That shopping trip had been my plan for the weekend, another precious moment stolen from me. Stephen shrugged, completely oblivious to my disappointment, as if these small betrayals meant nothing. Stephen told me his mother had offered to help, claiming she wanted to give me a rest. Rest? I let out a bitter laugh, the word tasting like vinegar in my mouth. The way he made it sound as if I needed a break from my own children cut me to the core. I struggled to keep my voice steady, though my heart was pounding like a drum. I told him we needed to talk about his parents, about this whole situation that was suffocating our marriage. He sighed heavily, his shoulders tensing up like a defensive wall. He begged me to stop, claiming he thought we had already resolved everything. Resolved what exactly? I challenged, my voice sharp with years of pent-up frustration. These decisions about our family, that were being made without me. I stood up, feeling anger rise inside me like a tide. I told him firmly that he couldn't keep making decisions without me, especially about our savings. His eyes narrowed to slits, reminding me of a predator ready to strike. He demanded to know what I meant, his voice dangerously low. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. I revealed that I'd overheard his phone conversation that morning with the real estate agent. Stephen's face flushed red, like a child caught in the act. The truth had finally come to light. He tried to defend himself, claiming it was just preliminary discussions, just gathering information. I cut him off mid-sentence, my voice trembling with hurt and anger. He ran his fingers through his hair in frustration, his irritation seeping into every word. He demanded to know what I wanted from him, insisting he was only trying to do what was best for our family. Our family? I repeated, the words echoing with hollow irony. I reminded him that this wasn't about his parents' family, or his mother's ideal vision of what a family should be. This was about us, Stephen, me, and our children. Stephen shot back defensively, insisting his parents were part of our family too. Something inside me shattered when he demanded to know why I couldn't understand. Because they're controlling everything. I exploded, years of suppressed frustration finally bursting like a dam breaking. I told him how his mother made decisions about our children without consulting me, how his father acted as if I didn't exist, and worst of all, how he allowed it all to happen. Stephen's face hardened like cement setting in the sun. He defended his parents, claiming they were just trying to help. Help? I let out a bitter laugh that tasted like vinegar in my mouth. I asked him if he called it help when his mother criticized my parenting, and his father ignored me at family dinners, treating me like a ghost at my own table. Stephen dismissed my concerns as dramatic, but I caught a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I stepped closer to him, my voice low and intense, like steel wrapped in silk. I challenged him to tell me the last time we made a decision as a couple, just the two of us, without his parents' input. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like a fish out of water. His silence spoke volumes. That's what I thought, I said, feeling the fight drain out of me like water down a drain. I told him we couldn't go on living like this, that something had to change. For a fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of the man I'd married, the kind, considerate man who had once put me first. But just as quickly, his expression closed off like shutters during a storm. He agreed that something needed to change, but his words felt like a slap in the face. He told me I needed to accept that this was our life now, that his parents were here to stay, and that everyone would be happier if I just accepted it. I stared at him, shock and pain coursing through me like ice in my veins. Was this really what our marriage had become, this hollow shell where I was expected to simply disappear into the background of my own life? The tension broke as the front door swung open, and I heard my mother-in-law's voice echoing through the house, followed by the excited chatter of my children. She called out that they were home, asking us to come see what they'd bought. Stephen shot me a look that clearly said our conversation was over, as final as a door being slammed shut. I stood frozen in place, watching him walk away to greet his mother and our children, feeling like a ghost in my own home. A terrifying reality sank deep into my bones like a winter chill. This wasn't just about Stephen's parents anymore, their constant interference and subtle manipulations. This was about the future of my marriage, crumbling before my eyes like sand through my fingers. For the first time, I wasn't even sure if there was a future left to save. The house settled into an eerie silence that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. I sat at the desk in our shared study, my heart pounding like a drum as I held a pen suspended over blank paper. This was the moment of decision, heavy with the weight of years of compromise and lost dreams. It was the point of no return, like stepping off the edge of a cliff. I glanced at the clock, its red numbers burning in the darkness. It read 2:37 a.m., a time when truth seems most raw and undeniable. Stephen lay sleeping upstairs, lost in peaceful dreams. He remained blissfully unaware of the seismic shift about to rock our world to its foundation. Our children were curled up in their beds, innocent angels unaware of the storm brewing beneath our roof. They were still untouched by the months of tension that had been building like a pressure cooker about to explode. With trembling hands that betrayed my inner turmoil, I began to write. I started the letter, "Dear Stephen, by the time you read this, the children and I will be gone. I can't live like this anymore. My vision blurred with tears as I poured years of disappointment, pain, and betrayal onto the paper, each word feeling like a stone being lifted from my heart. I poured my heart onto the paper, writing about being pushed aside, the constant interference from my in-laws, and how I'd sacrificed my dreams only to be treated like a stranger in my own home. A sob escaped my throat as I signed my name, the finality of it hitting me like a physical blow. I quickly stifled it, terrified of waking anyone at this crucial moment. This wasn't the life I had imagined for myself, not even close to the rosy future we had planned together. But plans change, I reminded myself, just as surely as people do. Sometimes, I realized, you need the courage to rewrite your own story. With trembling hands, I carefully folded the letter and placed it in the center of Stephen's desk where he couldn't miss it. Then, my heart pounding like a drum, I crept up the stairs as quietly as possible to wake the children. Sienna's sleepy voice called out, "Mom?" as I gently roused her from her dreams. She asked if something was wrong, her innocent eyes full of concern. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," I whispered, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. I told her we were going on a little trip, asking if she could be a good girl and help with her brother. She nodded drowsily, rubbing her eyes as she climbed out of bed. Mateo was easier to wake, always having been the lighter sleeper of the two. Within minutes, both children were dressed and ready, clutching their favorite stuffed animals like lifelines. I held my breath as I tiptoed down the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity. My heart was pounding as I prayed Stephen wouldn't wake up. His snoring from our bedroom brought me both relief and heartache, like a bittersweet reminder of what once was. This man I had loved more than anything in the world now felt like a stranger, as unfamiliar as a person passing on the street. We made it to the car without incident, the night air wrapping around us like a protective blanket. As I was buckling the children into their car seats, Sienna's small voice cut through the night air like a knife. She asked where Daddy was and if he wasn't coming with us, her innocent question piercing my heart. I froze, feeling like ice had replaced the blood in my veins. Though I had known this question was inevitable, nothing could have prepared me for the pain of answering it. I told her softly that Daddy needed to stay here, but promised they would see him soon, the words feeling hollow in my mouth. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I couldn't shatter her world completely, not yet. The time for hard truths would come later. As I slid into the driver's seat, movement caught my eye like a flash in the darkness. There, in the upstairs window, stood Stephen's mother, her silhouette stark against the dim light. Our eyes met and time seemed to freeze, like a photograph capturing a moment of no return. I watched as understanding dawned on her face, followed by anger, and then, surprisingly, an almost satisfied smirk that flickered across her features. Without giving myself time to think, I started the engine and backed out of the driveway. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I drove down the dark, empty street that seemed to stretch endlessly before me. Questions swirled in my mind like autumn leaves in a storm. Where were we going? What would we do? The weight of uncertainty threatened to crush me, pressing down like a heavy blanket. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror at my sleeping children, a calm settled over me like gentle rain. We would make it through this somehow. We had to, there was no other choice. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, my phone vibrated against the seat like a harbinger of what was to come. Stephen's name flashed across my screen, and his message sent chills down my spine. He threatened me about taking his children away, warning that his lawyers would be contacting me, and swearing he'd never forgive me. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat, like it was burning my hands. In that moment, my resolve hardened like steel. In the back seat, my precious children slept peacefully, their faces angelic and untouched by the chaos that had become our lives. Despite all the turmoil swirling around us, their peaceful expressions were like a balm to my wounded spirit. As I rested my head against the steering wheel, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over, a sudden knock on the window made me jump like a startled cat. A familiar voice called out my name, asking if it was really me. When I looked up, blinking through my tears, I couldn't believe my eyes. There stood a face I hadn't seen in years. It was Stephanie, my best friend from high school, looking just as warm and caring as she had 20 years ago. She stared at me, with concern etched across her face, those same worried eyes I remembered from our teenage years. I scrambled out of the car, asking what she was doing there. She wrapped me in a tight embrace that felt like coming home. She explained that she was the property manager there, but quickly brushed aside any talk about herself, focusing instead on my well-being. Something in her caring tone broke the dam I'd been holding back. Before I knew it, I was sobbing in her arms, pouring out my whole story between gasping breaths. Stephanie listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with each word I shared. When I finished, she gripped my shoulders with the fierce protectiveness I remembered from our youth. She insisted that I couldn't stay here, telling me she had a spare room at her house and I was coming with her. An hour later, my children were tucked safely into comfortable beds, and I found myself sitting at Stephanie's kitchen table, staring into a steaming cup of tea that seemed to offer more comfort than I'd felt in months. Stephanie gently asked me what I planned to do next, her voice full of concern and understanding. I stared into my tea, feeling utterly lost and overwhelmed by the weight of my situation. I admitted that while I didn't know exactly what to do, I knew I couldn't stay there anymore, and Stephen's threatening message had only strengthened my resolve to fight for my children. Stephanie's eyes took on a fierce, determined look that reminded me of our high school days. She insisted that I needed to fight, telling me I was the smartest person she knew and that I could handle this challenge. "I don't even have a lawyer," I whispered, feeling the crushing reality of my situation bearing down on me, like a heavy weight. Stephanie's face lit up with a knowing smile that made me curious despite my despair. She mentioned that she might be able to help, asking if I remembered Ryan from high school. My heart skipped a beat at the mention of his name. Ryan, the boy I'd secretly had feelings for all those years ago, memories flooding back like a warm wave. I felt my cheeks flush as I asked about him, trying to keep my voice steady. Stephanie told me he has become one of the top divorce attorneys in the state, then hesitated before adding that he had always had a soft spot for me. I felt the blush spread across my face, followed immediately by a wave of guilt. Here I was, in the middle of leaving my husband, and I was blushing like a schoolgirl over an old crush. I protested that I couldn't afford a top attorney, reminding her that I'd left everything behind. Stephanie waved away my concerns with the same dismissive gesture she'd used back in our school days. She insisted that I should at least meet with him, if only for her sake. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated again, making me jump. It was another message from Stephen, his words appearing like poison on my screen. He wrote that his parents were devastated, demanding to know how I could do this to our family, ordering me to come home immediately, and threatening that I'd never see the children again if I didn't. My hands were shaking as I showed Stephanie the message, watching her face darken with anger. "That settles it," Stephanie declared firmly, telling me she'd call Ryan first thing in the morning. That night, as I lay sleepless in my bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of standing on the edge of a cliff, about to take a leap into the unknown. Meeting Ryan wasn't just another appointment, it was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. It meant finally admitting that my marriage was truly over, like closing a book I'd been trying to keep open far too long. As I recalled Stephen's cold words and the suffocating presence of his parents, a stark reality hit me like a physical blow. My marriage had ended long ago, withering away like a flower without water. I just lacked the courage to acknowledge what my heart already knew. The next morning, I woke to Stephanie's voice drifting down the hallway. She was talking to Ryan, confirming my appointment for 2 p.m. and expressing her gratitude. When she turned to face me coming out of my room, her expression was a mixture of excitement and concern, like a mother watching her child take first steps. She told me that Ryan had agreed to meet with me today. My heart began pounding like a drum against my ribs. This moment would determine the course of my children's lives and mine, like a fork in the road we couldn't return from. I heard myself respond with an acceptance, surprised by the strength in my own voice. I was ready to move forward, ready to fight. As I hugged my still sleepy children, preparing for the day ahead, I felt a spark I hadn't experienced in years, like a long dormant ember coming back to life. It was hope, pure and simple. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I wasn't alone anymore, not like before. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to fight for the life I deserved. As I sat waiting in Ryan's office, I smoothed my blouse nervously, trying to calm my racing heart. The man who walked in was a far cry from the teenage boy I remembered from all those years ago. Ryan exuded confidence as he extended his hand, offering me a warm, reassuring smile that seemed to light up the room. He commented on how long it had been, apologizing that we had to meet again under such circumstances, his voice carrying a gentle understanding that made my heart flutter. As I sat down, I felt a familiar warmth rise in my chest, like an old song playing on the radio. But I quickly pushed those feelings aside, like closing a worn photo album. I reminded myself why I was here, my children's faces clear in my mind. This wasn't about old crushes or what-ifs from decades past. This was about my future, my children's future, and everything we had at stake. Ryan listened intently to my situation, his brow furrowing with each new detail I shared, like a doctor examining a complex case. When I finished, he leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that spoke volumes. He didn't sugarcoat things, warning me that with Steven's resources and his parents' involvement, this could get ugly, but he promised we would fight with everything we had. His words ignited something inside me, like a match striking dry kindling. It was a flame I thought had been extinguished years ago, now flickering back to life. I asked him what our first step should be, my voice stronger than it had been in months. For the next hour, we strategized as Ryan laid out our approach, his legal expertise guiding us through the battlefield ahead. I felt my old lawyer instincts awakening, like muscles remembering how to move after a long sleep. As we discussed the arrangements, my phone vibrated against the desk like a warning bell. "It's Steven," I announced, standing up with renewed determination. I knew I had to take this call. I stepped out of the office and answered the phone, bracing myself. Steven's voice came through cold and controlled, asking where I was, each word sharp as ice. Steven told me everyone was devastated, demanding I bring the children home immediately. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I told him firmly that I wasn't coming back, that I'd hired a lawyer, and all future communication would need to go through him. After a moment of stunned silence, Steven's voice turned venomous, dripping with threats. He snarled that I wouldn't get away with taking his children, promising to destroy me until I'd consider myself lucky just to see them at all. The line went dead, leaving me in crushing silence. I stood there trembling until I felt Ryan's gentle hand on my shoulder, his touch anchoring me to reality. He asked softly if I was all right, his voice full of genuine concern. I nodded, wiping away tears I hadn't even realized were falling down my cheeks. I told him through shaky breaths about Steven's threats to take the children away, my voice trailing off as fear gripped my heart. Ryan stopped me gently, but firmly, placing both hands on my shoulders like a protective shield. He assured me that we wouldn't let that happen, telling me I was stronger than I knew, and reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. As I met his eyes, a wave of emotions washed over me like a tide coming in. I felt gratitude, fear, and something else, something I wasn't ready to name yet, something that made my heart skip a beat. I took a step back, gathering myself like picking up scattered pieces. Ryan's voice turned serious as he brought up the need to discuss my career. I blinked in confusion, my mind struggling to shift gears. I reminded him hesitantly that I'd quit my job, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. He nodded gravely, his expression serious. He explained that my unemployment would work against us in court, emphasizing the need to prove I could independently support the children. The realization hit me like a freight train, knocking the wind from my lungs. I had given up everything for my family, and now that sacrifice might cost me everything I held dear. That thought hit me like a physical blow. I don't know if I can go back, I whispered, doubt creeping into my voice like a shadow. Ryan's expression softened, his eyes holding that same warmth I remembered from our high school days. He reminded me that the Kendra he knew in high school could do anything, and that woman was still there, just waiting to be rediscovered. As I left Ryan's office that day, my mind was spinning like a carousel out of control. The path ahead seemed impossible, like trying to climb a mountain in the dark. I had to face Stephen and his parents, rebuild my career, and do it all while protecting my children, a task that seemed as daunting as moving mountains. Yet for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, like a tiny flame flickering in the darkness. That night, as I tucked Mateo and Sienna into bed, Sienna looked up at me with those big eyes that could break any mother's heart. She asked if we would ever go home again, her small voice trembling with uncertainty. My heart clenched like a fist in my chest. "Oh, my precious one," I whispered, holding her tight against me. I told her that home was wherever we were together, that we were our own family. As I held my daughter, I made a silent vow, as binding as any oath ever sworn. I would build us a new home, no matter the cost, no matter how fierce the battle, a home filled with love and respect, where we could be truly ourselves. The road ahead seemed endless, but I felt ready to take it on, like a runner at the starting line. The old Kendra was awakening, ready to take the helm of her life once again. The courthouse loomed before me, like a fortress. It was an imposing building that symbolized the battle I was about to face. I gripped my briefcase tightly, trying to steady my racing heart that seemed to beat in time with my footsteps. It was the day of our temporary custody hearing, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. I knew Stephen and his parents would pull out all the stops, using every weapon in their arsenal against me. Ryan placed his hand on my shoulder reassuringly, his touch steady and grounding. He told me everything would be all right, reminding me to remember all we had prepared for. I took a deep breath and nodded, stepping into the building with legs that felt like lead. My eyes immediately found Stephen and his parents, huddled with their lawyer like vultures preparing to strike. My blood began to boil as I caught my mother-in-law's contemptuous expression, her face a mask of superiority I'd grown to know all too well. As the hearing began, I listened with mounting horror as Stephen's lawyer painted me as an unstable, irresponsible mother who had whimsically abandoned her family. They twisted my decision to quit my job, turning my sacrifice for my family into a weapon against me. Ryan skillfully presented our case, highlighting my successful career as an attorney and my dedication to my children. But I could see the skepticism in the judge's expression, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Doubt began to eat away at me like acid. Had I made a terrible mistake in fighting for what I believed was right? During the recess, I heard my mother-in-law's voice in the hallway, her words carrying clearly through the air. She was telling someone that once they got custody, she would move closer to help with the children, claiming they needed a stable home, not a flighty mother who couldn't decide what to do with her life. Something inside me snapped like a twig under too much pressure. Before I could think, my feet were carrying me toward her, years of suppressed anger propelling me forward. I confronted her, accusing her of trying to push me out from the very beginning. I told her I'd had enough of being marginalized, that these were my children, and I would fight with everything I had. Stephen's father stepped between us, his presence as imposing as ever. Stephen's father accused me of losing my mind, claiming I was proving their point and that I was unfit to raise my children, his words cutting through me like a knife. I felt a gentle touch on my arm and turned to find Stephanie standing there, her eyes blazing with protective fury. She told my in-laws to back off, her voice carrying years of watching me suffer their manipulation. She declared they couldn't intimidate me anymore, standing like a shield between us. As a crowd began to gather in the hallway, I felt Ryan's familiar presence as he gently pulled me away from the scene. He warned me softly that this wasn't helping our case, reminding me to focus on the hearing. But the damage was already done, like ink spilled on white fabric. Back in the courtroom, I could feel the judge's disapproving gaze weighing heavily upon me. The judge cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom like a death knell. He announced that, considering the evidence presented and the recent incident in the hallway, he was granting temporary custody to the father with supervised visitation rights for me. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, everything I knew crumbling beneath my feet. I couldn't breathe, feeling like all the air had been sucked from the room. This couldn't be real, it felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Ryan immediately requested a recess, which the judge reluctantly granted. In a daze, I followed Ryan into a private conference room, my legs moving automatically like a puppet on strings. Ryan spoke to me, with urgency in his voice, trying to break through my shock. He insisted this wasn't over, but explained we needed to change our strategy and prove to the court that I was stable, capable, and put my children first. I nodded numbly as tears rolled down my cheeks, feeling like my heart was being torn from my chest. "Why are they taking my babies?" I whispered, my voice breaking with desperation as I told Ryan I couldn't lose them. He gripped my shoulders firmly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that commanded my attention. Ryan urged me to fight back, reminding me of the strong, unintimidated Kendra he knew, asking where that woman had gone. His words pierced through my despair like a shaft of sunlight breaking through storm clouds, igniting a spark of determination in my soul. I wiped my eyes and straightened my spine, feeling strength return to my body like an old friend coming home. I told him that woman was right there, ready to fight with everything she had. As we prepared to return to the courtroom, I caught sight of Stephen and his parents, their faces like masks of superiority. Their arrogant expressions only strengthened my resolve, like steel being tempered in fire. This fight wasn't just about me anymore, not by a long shot. This was about showing my children how to break free from control and stand up for themselves, a lesson worth any price. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. In fact, it was just beginning, like the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. This time, I was ready for the fight, armed with truth and determination. I stood in the courtroom, my heart pounding like a drum as the judge prepared to deliver his final ruling. Months of battles, sleepless nights, and unwavering determination had led to this moment, like threads weaving together into a tapestry of hope. Stephen and his parents sat across from me, their faces a mixture of confidence and contempt that made my blood boil. The judge began by addressing the matter of custody for Mateo and Sienna, his voice cutting through the hushed courtroom. His words echoed through the silent chamber like thunder. He announced that the court had carefully considered all evidence presented. I held my breath, feeling Ryan's reassuring presence beside me like an anchor in a storm. The judge declared that primary custody would be awarded to me, Kendra Davis, with generous visitation rights granted to Stephen Davis. Time seemed to freeze, as if the world itself had stopped spinning on its axis. I heard Stephen's mother gasp, and watched as Stephen's face crumbled in disbelief, like a sandcastle being washed away by the tide. But I could only focus on the overwhelming sense of relief and vindication that flooded through my entire body like a warm summer rain. As the judge continued detailing the custody arrangements, my eyes found Ryan's across the courtroom. His smile was proud and supportive, and there was something else there too, something that made my heart skip a beat like a schoolgirl's. Outside the courtroom, Stephen approached me, his steps hesitant and measured. With his parents hovering nearby, I caught a glimpse of the man I had once loved, like looking at an old photograph faded by time. He spoke my name softly, his voice carrying years of regret as he apologized for everything. I nodded, surprised to find my heart lighter than expected. Remarkably, I felt no anger, just a gentle acceptance of what had been and what needed to be. I told him I was sorry too, but assured him this was best for everyone involved. As I watched them walk away, I felt the weight of years lifting from my shoulders like a heavy coat being removed. This victory wasn't just about custody, it was so much more. I had reclaimed my life, my independence, and most importantly, myself. Stephanie rushed over and wrapped me in a bear hug that felt like coming home. She exclaimed that she had known I could do it, her voice full of pride and joy. Through happy tears, I laughed and told her I couldn't have done it without her, remembering how she had saved me that night at the motel when hope seemed lost. She squeezed my hand tight, the gesture speaking volumes about our friendship. She suggested we celebrate with the children, and perhaps, she added with a knowing smile, with that handsome lawyer too. I felt my cheeks flush as I glanced over at Ryan, who was carefully tucking papers into his briefcase, looking every bit the distinguished attorney he had become. Our eyes met, and that familiar feeling danced in my chest like butterflies taking wing. Later that night, after the joyful reunion with Mateo and Sienna, I sat on Stephanie's porch watching the sunset paint the sky. Ryan joined me, carrying 2 glasses of wine, his presence as comforting as a warm blanket. He offered a toast to new beginnings, his voice carrying hope and promise. I smiled and clinked my glass against his, feeling like a young woman again. I echoed his toast to new beginnings, the words tasting sweet on my tongue. We sat in comfortable silence, like old friends who needed no words to understand each other. Then Ryan spoke, his voice gentle in the evening air. He told me how amazing I'd been these past months, fighting for my children and myself, noting how different I was from the woman who first walked into his office. I nodded, feeling a wave of pride wash over me like a warm tide. I told him I'd found a part of myself I thought was lost forever, my voice strong with newfound confidence. Ryan's hand found mine, and the touch sent electricity coursing through me like a teenager's first love. He asked if I'd like to have dinner with him sometime, once things settled down. I looked into his eyes, searching for answers to questions I hadn't even formed yet. What I saw there was warmth, admiration, and something more, the promise of possibilities stretching out before us like an open road. For a moment, I hesitated, old fears threatening to surface like shadows at dusk. Ancient anxieties tried to creep in, whispering doubts in my ear. But then I remembered everything I'd overcome, every battle I'd won, every step I'd taken to reclaim my life. Yes, I'd like that, I answered softly, my voice steady with certainty. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues, I reflected on my journey, like reading the chapters of a well-worn book. Every moment of pain, struggle, and despair had led me here, shaping me like a sculptor's chisel. I had rediscovered my strength, reclaimed my independence, and found a support system I never knew I needed. Though the future remained uncertain, for the first time in years, my heart danced with anticipation like a young girl's. On the horizon lay my children, my freedom, and the possibility of new love, all shimmering like stars coming out at twilight. Taking a sip of wine, feeling the warmth of Ryan's hand in mine, I realized something profound. This wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. My beginning. And I was ready to embrace every single moment of it, like a precious gift finally unwrapped.